Hello, love of physics. That's a great thing to love. Your thoughts on the Sam Harris versus William Lane Craig debate. I thought I'd respond on the issue of the is-ought gap and shoot the camera. Probably just shook the world from the other end. But the is-ought gap. The question is, the gap between is and ought is an issue of how do you derive something that ought to be or should be based on something that simply is. In other words, what should be is based on choices and what could be and what ought to be. And the question is, based on what is, how do we make the jump from what is from what ought to be? Now, if we simply say that to avoid the greatest possible misery for all sentient beings is something we ought to avoid, we haven't really derived that ought statement from an is statement, from a fact of something that exists. In other words, what exists? What do we know exists? What facts do we know are true that tell us that this ought to be that way instead of another? And we all, as humans, we all seem to somehow know that we ought to avoid the greatest possible misery. But the question is, knowing that we know that, and knowing that it ought to be that way, what is the basis for that? Why is it that way? And is it possible? And the question is it possible for it to be that way without God? And so the question is, to put it as simply as I can, yes, we all know we ought to avoid the greatest possible misery for all people, but how is that derived from an is statement? That's the only way you're going to bridge the is-ought gap. How is that derived from an is statement?